name's Jason, as you heard. You've all got a copy of this contract, I believe, in front of you, and I'd propose to go through it sort of in order and hit on the highlights like Scott said. Happy to have you interrupt me with any questions you might have, and I think we've probably got 20 minutes or so left here, so let's begin on the first page. Just a basic thing, you probably all realize this, but the blanks at the top there for owner and RMT, you want to make sure you've got full legal names there. If you're doing business as a certain name, but in fact your clinic has say a numbered company, BC Ltd, that's what should go on here, and then you might follow that with DBA, whatever you're actually doing business as, how the public knows you. But make sure you use your legal name, okay? And likewise, make sure you've got the full name of the RMT that you're dealing with, because John Smith might be a popular name, right? Not going to hit on every clause here, so I'll skip down, start with 1.1, the term. Obviously, you want to set a term for this agreement. The idea here is that this is an independent contractor agreement. Now, we're going to see some terms about that later in the contract here, and the presumption is that most clinic owners want the RMT to be treated as an independent contractor. That means they're more responsible for certain things like dealing with taxes, and you don't have the same responsibilities to them that an employer would. However, as we'll discuss, what constitutes an employment agreement isn't really dependent upon what it says in here. So you'll set a term for this agreement, and then you might renew that term later on. You might enter into a new agreement later, but start with whatever term you think is appropriate, and you're probably going to be consistent and perhaps increase it as time goes on and you get to know that RMT. 1.2 here says that the RMT is going to practice exclusively at the clinic. This might be a term that you change. I'd suggest that you seriously consider deleting this actually if that's not a requirement for you. If you don't mind that the RMT goes elsewhere, it will help you if you're ever forced to argue that they're an independent contractor and not an employee. 1.3 here says that their services will be at times agreed upon. The more freedom they have to set their schedule, the more independent they are, the less likely they are to be an employee. And so again, consider how much you need here, and consider how much flexibility you can give them. You're going to have to you're going to have to probably set consistent practices at your clinic. You've probably got hours that you need them to work, but the more control you have over that, the more they look like an employee to anybody who's really looking at the situation objectively. We skip to the next page. At 1.6 here, we've stipulated that the RMT is to maintain active membership in the College of Massage Therapists and the Massage Therapists Association. You might have other requirements. I draw this section to your attention because it's a section you might want to modify and add those further kinds of requirements. This is a convenient paragraph to do that at. Section 1.8 talks about clinic facilities and equipment. One of the things that the Employment Standards Branch will look at when they're trying to determine whether or not an RMT is, or anybody is, an independent contractor or an employee, is whether they're supplying their own equipment. Now, you may have equipment that you're providing. Presumably you're providing a room. You might be providing the table that's in the room as well. You might be providing other things that are necessary for the practice. The more you provide, the less the RMT is required to provide, the more it looks like you're employing them. You're giving them the tools of their trade to perform their job. So again, consider how much you're giving them there. And this is something that, as a practical matter, it may not be practical for them to be dragging their table in and out all the time. But just be aware that that's one of the factors that's looked at if you're ever challenged on the idea that they're an independent contractor. 1.10 talks about alterations or modifications here. This agreement here, we've tried to include that here just to be clear on a point about this. I just want to point out that it says it's going to be with the consent of the owner. In fact, if your clinic is established, there's probably not any requirement for any modifications, but if you're working with the RMT, if you're establishing this clinic and doing things with them, I would suggest that, notwithstanding what it says here, that you could give them permission to do things that they request. You do the work, you get it done with the agreement, and get this in writing, that they will pay you if it's for their benefit, or that somehow that will be deducted from the amounts that you reimburse them. 1.12 talks about a privacy policy. Now, every clinic needs to have a privacy policy. There is a privacy policy, I believe, already provided on the MTA website. So you'll be able to download that if you don't have that already. And of course, you can draft your own privacy policy, but I believe that model policy would be recommended. There are other policies that you should have as well, in fact. You should have a sexual harassment policy if you've got a number of employees. Now, I'm distinguishing when I say employees between RMTs, who we want to treat as independent contractors, and say the receptionist. But you might have other staff members. In any event, everybody who's working at the clinic should be made aware of your privacy policy and your sexual harassment policy, and those should be posted somewhere that they've got access to. And I would suggest that you go so far as to get them to acknowledge the receipt of that policy. Now, there's a section later in the agreement here where you can choose to add, well, there's a reference that we'll get to, where you can choose to add the policy to this agreement as a schedule to the agreement, just something that's attached sort of after everybody's, well, at the end of the agreement, where it ostensibly ends, but then continues to go on. If we skip to the next page, you see at the top it talks about patient records. Now, Scott's already talked about that and told you that fundamentally it's the patient or your the clients of the clinic who own those records, right? Schedule E to your bylaws says that the RMT is responsible for maintaining those records and really supposed to keep them at all times. But I think as a practical matter, those records are kept at the clinic, and by and large, I would imagine, and this agreement presumes really, that the clinic does want to keep those records. Now, if that's not the case, you're going to need to modify this agreement accordingly. But the presumption here, if I can continue with it, that you want to maintain the records means that you've got to agree on certain things. And so it says at 2.2, for example, that the RMT is going to fill in those records, maintain those records, update them. It says here that they're going to do that at all times. You want a record of when the patient came in. You want to make sure that those records are, up to date, professionally maintained. Your staff would probably be the ones to be filing those, I would imagine. But again, it depends how large your clinic is and whether or not, in fact, you've got staff to do that. We've said here you own it. But if the patient goes elsewhere, the patient is entitled to take those records. You may be entitled to take a copy. In fact, I believe that you are. If the RMT goes elsewhere, they may be entitled to a copy as well. And we've said here, in fact, that you will give them a copy. But nevertheless, sorry, please.
Is there a fee associated to make that copy or administrative?
For administrative costs, I have to say I don't think that, well, I haven't seen anyway in your bylaws any mention that. I can say for myself, in my practice, I'm entitled to charge a reasonable fee for those copies and such, but I'm not entitled to charge for the labor really associated with it. So that reasonable fee may be the photocopies and perhaps the mailing that you have to do and things like that. So I'd imagine at the very least you're able to recover your basic costs there, but I don't think you can say, well, it's $100, and set some arbitrary number that doesn't really reflect the cost to you. So Section 3 is a whole section here saying independent contractor. That's what the RMT is. The truth is it doesn't matter what's written in here. What matters is what actually happens at your clinic. The Employment Standards Branch is going to look at things like how much control does the RMT exercise over their practice? Do they supply their own equipment? Do they have a chance of profit? Do they have a chance of running a loss? Are they really actually independent and have their own business essentially, and they have this relationship with you where you've agreed they're going to come in on the terms of this agreement, or have they become an employee in fact, where they're not providing equipment, or even if they are providing equipment, you're telling them exactly what to do and when to do it, or they're going to get paid regardless of what happens. Now, we'll see later on here the way this agreement is structured. They're paid based on the money that comes in due to the clients or the patients that they actually see. So we're not specifying any wage in here, but it's not as simple as saying they're an independent contractor and saying that you're not paying them a wage. You have to look at what your actual practice is, and it's a very subjective analysis, unfortunately. So this agreement is written to try and make them an independent contractor, because by making them an independent contractor, you can say they're responsible for remitting taxes. You can say that they're responsible for their WorkSafe deductions. You can say that they've got all these responsibilities that normally would belong to the employer and be your responsibility. So you want to offload that where you can, but you can't have it both ways. You can't control them like you would an employee and still make them responsible for all of those things. And you might want to think about what's more important to you. Sometimes you might want exact consistency, certain hours, massage therapy performed a very specific way. That's fine. That may be good business practice, but be aware it makes it more likely that you're an employer. And if you're an employer, then you've got these responsibilities. You've got to remit the taxes. You've got to pay those WorkSafe deductions, and on and on. And you've got to give them vacation pay and things of that nature. And then you've got to give them notice of termination, for example. There's statutory minimums and things like that. So it specifically says at 3.2 that the owner shall not interfere with the practice of massage therapy. Or it talks about the philosophy there. That's a word that was in the original version of this contract, and we've kept it there. Consider whether or not that's actually, whether or not you're really willing to let them do that. And knowing that that's in this agreement, consider who you're hiring and whether or not they're a good fit. Because if you're not going to exercise control over them, you're putting faith in them to do things in a way that you're comfortable with. And that's a balance that you've got to strike as people who are operating their own business, right? If we move to the next page, that's page 4 now, section 3.6. It's a specific point here about insurance. I believe, Harry, I think, is going to be speaking about insurance. When you see we've got a big blank there, but that's where that insurance provision would be laid out. And you may, in fact, want to expand on this. Probably Harry will say you do, but that's a blank there, and I'm just drawing it to your attention because this, of course, is an important section. Payments, 4.1. We've got this set up so that you're going to be paid a percentage. Okay, whatever the revenue is, you're going to receive a percentage. I've seen other agreements between clinic owners, and this is the usual arrangement that I see. Perhaps you do it some other way. Maybe you have a tiered structure, depending upon the number of hours that they work and how much they might get. There's all kinds of arrangements that can be made. So if your situation is different, if this doesn't work for you, this would be a section to delete and replace, obviously. But right now, I'll just point out to you that it says for the first 6 months, you're going to get a certain percentage, and then thereafter, it will change. And the idea there is maybe during the first 6 months, they're not going to have as much, as many patients as they're seeing. And then later on, hopefully, the ball has gotten rolling and patients are coming in on a regular basis to see that particular RMT. So the change occurs there. But you can consider whether or not this is appropriate for you. Section 4.2 says that the clinic is going to collect all of the payments. So the idea here, and from the patient's perspective, it really appears like the RMT just works at the clinic. They're going to pay at the front desk probably. That's kind of the concept there. It may not work for your clinic, so delete this or change it if your clinic operates differently. But if you've got the staff to do it, you really do want to be in control of the flow of money there to make sure that you're receiving everything and you take responsibility then for giving the RMT their share as opposed to the other way around. Now, of course, if I was talking to RMTs, I might tell them to try and work it the other way, but 4.3 says you're going to maintain a bank account. The idea here is really just sound accounting practices, that you're going to have an account that's specific to the revenues received by the clinic. There's going to be a paper trail for everything that's there. I believe it says that the RMT would be given access to the records somewhere in here if necessary, on 4.4, I think. And it talks about when payments will be made at 4.3. So make sure you are doing that. And I presume, you know, you've got your clinic set up, you've got a registered corporation probably to run that clinic, and then you'll have an account in the name of that corporation, right? And that corporation is where the money needs to be deposited, and then the checks to the RMT and everyone else come out of that. Yes, please.
It seems crazy to me that you're giving, you would, well, as clinic owners, we would say giving access to our bank account information wise to an individual that could be there a month or 3 years. And I don't even think that's even something realistic, because how does it benefit them?
Well, I'll make a note of that, but I think the point here is that you want to have a paper trail so that they can't say to you later on, well, I saw, you know, I spent 10 hours working, you should have collected $1,000 or whatever it might be, and you're saying, well, I only collected 500. There's got, you know, if that argument arises, it may be that you're not going to give them your full bank account information. But you do want some kind of paper trail, obviously, I think, to be able to prove your side of the case, right? That shows these are the deposits that were made. You know, if checks were made out to the company and deposits came in, you're able to show clearly you only received 500.
Maybe it's access to the receipt book or something. So.
Perhaps, yes. And, you know, I'm going to mark this section here to consider how we might change that.
Because, yeah, we're clinic owners, right? I mean, that's a good RMT position. That's not a good clinic owner.
Well, I should...
That creates administrative nightmare.
I take your point, and I am making a note of that, and everybody in here might want to consider that as well and mark this section appropriately. Bear in mind, this agreement is supposed to be something that RMTs will access just as much as clinic owners, right? It's available on the MTA website for everyone to use, and I think anybody who does get into an agreement with another clinic owner is likely to want to at least, you know, compare that with what's going on here. So this is supposed to be a balanced agreement, but you're free, of course, as clinic owners, and obviously would want to make changes like that. Please go ahead.
I was just going to say, and these guys are all basically saying something similar, is that I have an accounting software program, and each time I write a check for my colleagues, I give them a printout that shows how many hours they treated and what they were billed for. And
so you're able to show them a full record, yeah.
RSMP and whatnot. So it's very transparent, but I would never give them access to my bank information.
Well, fair enough, fair enough. And I'm making a note of this here.
Can I just there's nothing in the draft of the agreement, of course, that entitles anyone but you to look at the bank records. The records that it's referring to are the records that are specific to the RMT in question.
Gotcha.
So it's actually just what you were talking about.
Right.
It's just those accounting records that show the monies in and monies out with respect to that individual RMT, which is why 4.4 says you should keep it separate for each RMT so that you can show it. There's nothing to do with your bank account or your GL or anything else, right?
It's good to be clear.
Please go ahead.
I just want to ask, in the previous section, when we're trying so hard to make it look as though this person's an independent contractor and not an employee, then now we're collecting all the money and distributing checks to them. That to me looks like they're an employee, and a stronger cause for them being their own, being an employee than an independent contractor.
You're correct, but no one thing is going to be determinative of that. It's not like the fact that you're doing that means that they're an employee, but absolutely yes, it would sort of count in that equation or that balancing act where they're adding up what makes them look like an employee and another column what makes them look like an independent contractor. That goes in the employee column. You're right.
Would it make a difference if you pay all of the revenue that they make out to them and then have them pay a check in rent, whether it's flat rent or a percentage? So there's that in and out.
I would say yes. And in fact, you know, if you were, I think the balance to be struck here is what's practical. If you considered that practical for you and were willing to go through that kind of process where all the revenue that was on their account was distributed to them without any deduction for you, and then they paid you and you called it rent for the room, that would certainly strengthen your position. Now, the agreement's not written that way, but there's no reason you couldn't change it to be that way. And I think really that does come down to a question of what's practical for you and what are you really doing. Now, I should say, you know, this agreement, if you find anything in it that doesn't reflect what you're doing or that's contrary to what you're doing, you should consider, okay, do I want to do what it says in this agreement, which is, I mean, as I say right now, or as Scott pointed out, really still a draft. But, I mean, there will be a version up on the website soon that is going to be sort of the model agreement. Does it reflect what you're doing? If it doesn't reflect what you're doing, do you want to change what you're doing or not? And if you don't want to change what you're doing, change what it says in here. I mean, by no means say one thing and do another. Try and be as consistent as possible, but recognize that that question of whether or not somebody's an independent contractor or an employee, that's a subjective analysis. It's really particular to every situation, okay? And there's not a one-size-fits-all, and we've tried to write a contract here that provides a good starting point for the majority of people, that tries to strike a balance between the interests of the RMT and the interests of the clinic owners. But you can make this as one-sided as you want, and you can change as much as you need to, and there's nothing to stop you from doing that. This is not a mandated agreement by any means. So, and if you want to talk about that further, I'd be happy to, perhaps at lunch. But for now, are there more questions on this section or in this general area right now? Please.
If you're not incorporated and every RMT in your office has their own business license, doesn't that make them an independent, like you're not there ringing their employers?
No. No, but, well, bear in mind, this is another point. I'm approaching this from the point of view of the Employment Standards Act, okay, and the Employment Standards Branch and any decision that they might make in adjudicating this. Canada Revenue Agency might agree with your position there, that because they've got their own business license and they're responsible for remitting their own taxes, that yes, they should be treated as an employee, an independent contractor for those tax purposes. But my comments are mostly coming from the perspective of the Employment Standards Branch and whether or not you're going to have the obligations that an employer has under that act. So in fact, there are different ways of looking at this, and WorkSafe BC, has a slightly different standard as well. Workers' Compensation Board might look at this slightly differently as well. So you could have different branches of government taking a different view on it, and you're not sure which one's going to scrutinize you at any one point. Please.
I just wanted to point out, because this is something I'm doing with my new venture, if the Canada Revenue Agency does rule against you and says that your contract is actually the opposite of what you intended, the penalty is actually placed on the clinic owner to go back and remit all of the deducted source deduction. So you would have to pay not only the owner's portion, but the RMT's portion, and if there is any assessment of fine or penalty above that. And they can go back, I'm not sure how far, but it could be a substantial penalty against your clinic if this is not screwed down tight and you know what you're doing and what you're into. It's arguable at some points, but the ruling then is final, and there's really a lack of appeal, I think. And if you wanted to comment on that.
Well, I'm not a tax advisor, and I wouldn't purport to give tax advice, but certainly I think everything you've said there is correct, and there can be substantial liability. I'm not sure how far back it goes, but yeah, they will certainly go back as far as they can. And so if that employee is, or at that point, somebody who's deemed to be an employee, despite what you tried to establish with your contract, if they're deemed to be an employee, they're going to look at what kind of benefits that person should have received, what kind of taxes you were supposed to have been paying. All of those things may be due. So unpaid vacation pay would be another example. You'd be responsible for remitting all of that. You're also subject to a penalty for failure to pay those amounts under the Employment Standards Act. 4.4 just speaks to, the example that was given here is long-distance telephone calls. And it goes on to say that expenses incurred by the owner for the personal benefit of the RMT are going to be charged to the RMT. This was something that was in the original version of this agreement, and you may feel it's appropriate to keep it. You may feel it's appropriate to expand upon the things that you find that RMTs sometimes do at your clinic that you don't like. When you can be specific about something in a contract, it helps because there's no doubt as to where the line is. They know they've crossed it if they made a long-distance telephone call for personal use. It says that. On the other hand, however, some of these expenses are so minimal that you might really just want to consider what you've found RMTs get up to and how much abuse there might be. You might want to cut out the part about long-distance telephone calls or expand it, depending upon what your experience has been in the practice. I just wanted to point out that that's another section that is easily changed and a convenient place to put things like that. The next page, page 5 now, deals with owner obligations. The more you say you're going to do, as I've already spoken to, the more you might be deemed to be an employer because you're taking responsibility for things. The more they're responsible for, the more they might be viewed as an independent contractor. It says here that you're going to provide office space, facilities, equipment, charts, demonstration materials. You're going to provide them with access to all of those things. I would suggest that list be whittled down if you want to, if you don't provide those things, or expanded if you intend to give them more. Probably best from the perspective of a clinic owner to reduce that list. The way it's worded there, it can you can easily add to or delete things. Goes on to say that those things will be in good working order and they'll be returned in good working order. I think that's fairly obvious. 5.2 says that the owner is going to provide a room and a table and laundry facilities. Again, that's a list that can easily be expanded. If you're not providing those things, the table, for example, we spoke about earlier, take it out of the list. Don't commit to providing more than you're certain you're going to provide, however. 5.3 talks about billing. This connects with the previous section here, that the clinic's going to provide all services required for billing. If you're not providing those services, delete this. 5.4 says that another thing you're going to do is rotate new patients. So if somebody comes in and they're not referred to a specific RMT or not looking for a specific RMT, you've actually got, you don't have a duty to independent contractors to necessarily, because your contracts can be on different terms as between RMTs. But as we've discussed, we know that they might be treated as employees. And employees, you do have a duty, in fact, to treat them fairly and equitably. So preferential treatment to one RMT could get you in trouble, in further trouble if it turns out they're employees. So I'd caution you against that, and just be aware that in here it says that you're going to treat them equally with those new patients, treat them equally in other respects in terms of access to laundry facilities and things of that nature. So after that, this agreement goes through termination provisions. Really, that comes down to failure of one party or another to deal with or fulfill their obligations. Independent contractors aren't entitled to the same degree of notice, but we've said in here that you'll give them 60 days notice if there's no cause, and cause is something like they've stolen from the clinic, or and it sets out other reasons in there. I'm not going to go through all of those, but just be aware that, actually I'm not sure, it's in this section 6. It talks about the notice provisions there, and I thought we had 60 days in there. I'm not seeing it right now, but this is where the rights are. I don't want to go through all those right now. I think we've taken most of the time on the important sections at the beginning. Next section, non-competition. Scott's spoken to that already and just pointed out that it is entirely subjective. What's appropriate, as he said, in West Van is completely different than what's appropriate in Spuzzum, and that's just because of the density of the people. You prevent somebody from making a living, that's not going to be upheld. And you'll see there's blanks for the number of months that they can't compete with you in the area or radius in kilometers that they have to stay out of during that period. 8 speaks to confidentiality. This is very bare bones confidentiality requirement. I think, in fact, we might add some more to that, just that they'll maintain privacy of records as well, even though it says that earlier, because this section speaks to confidentiality. You can have entire agreements on confidentiality going on for, multiple pages, but this is kind of the minimum that we've put in here, and I think it's probably sufficient for most of you, because they already have those professional obligations with respect to the records. The indemnity there's 9.1 and 9.2, that's reciprocal. They're indemnifying you essentially for their negligence. You're indemnifying them against your negligence. Probably the RMT is in a riskier position there, but this is written to be a balanced agreement, hopefully, or somewhat balanced. And so you giving them an indemnity, you could take that out if you want, or you could try, but obviously right now we're contemplating having this in the model agreement, and I think we would keep it because we have to ourselves in the MTA maintain a balanced approach to things. But the risk of the negligent things that you can do are not likely to have nearly the severity and the harmful effects that negligence on the RMT's part might have. Just be particularly careful about those records that you are keeping. 10, I've mentioned already, schedules. That's really there just so that you can add things to this agreement in a convenient way. So anything that you want to be binding by them signing onto this agreement, add on to the agreement as a schedule. And then finally at the end there, it says this is the entire agreement. So if you do enter into an agreement, well, this particular one anyway, with an RMT that you're already dealing with, it says it supersedes the prior agreements, and that it's the entire agreement. And so if you've said something orally, or they've promised you something orally, if you really want that or really intend to abide by that, it should be added into this agreement in writing. Are there any final questions?
I'll just make a final comment on that point. We not uncommonly deal with wrongful dismissal actions or breach of contract actions, these independent contractors, whereby people start out with agreements like this. They spend a lot of money and they pay us, lawyers like us, a lot of money to draft them all. And they have, I've got 3 right now in my office I can think of, very senior positions, all 3 with nonprofits, by the way, that started out with very well-defined job descriptions. Over the course of 2 years, the job description between the executive director and the high-powered help that they hired evolved and it changed. Nothing was changed in the agreement. The agreement was very clear by the end of the tenure that these individuals, in each case, were no longer doing the job that they had signed up for. They were getting paid more money, and they were doing different things. You can guess what happens next. A new board comes on. They're not quite so happy with these senior individuals, and they're shown the door. They're no longer independent contractors. They had become employees because they had changed the nature of the relationship. The executive director had changed the nature of the relationship of these 3 senior individuals without the board ever knowing about it. And so we have commenced actions for wrongful dismissal in each of those cases. And each of those individuals were making salaries of in excess of $150,000 a year by the time they were done. And now they're going to get severance going back about probably 8-9 months. All of which would have been foreclosed had anybody in the society involved turned their minds to the fact that the agreement they signed gave them 1 month severance. So that's cost the society the better part of $200,000 because they just didn't go back and change the agreement. So if you've got people that and things evolve and the circumstances and relationships change, just turn your mind to whether you need to document it or not. Because if you don't, then they can become employees. And this document that you may have spent a lot of money finalizing and fine-tuning and adopting to your circumstances is worthless to you. All right? So that's important for people to understand, because what happens with a lot of these things, it's like your will, right? You do your will and you forget about it. It's important you don't forget about this. When you do this with your employees, with your independent contractors, it's a very, very good thing to do is set annual review dates with these things. Just have somebody pull them out and look at them and say, is there anything in here we need to change or update or revise? It's a simple thing. It takes you 10 minutes, and it could save you a lot of money. I just want to also encourage you, you guys have the cards in the folders. I would really encourage you, the kind of feedback we had today is excellent. Yeah, what we're looking for. If you can email me or Jason with any further comments or revisions, once you've had a chance to look at it in further detail, we very much appreciate that. And because we're going to take those comments, revise it, and then it will come back to the board, the MTA, for their review. And then we'll probably go through the process of feedback, I'm assuming, and then eventually it'll get posted with, and don't worry, there's going to be all sorts of caveats all over this thing, because the last thing I want anybody doing is taking this off the website and using it and not understanding what they're doing and then suing me. So I've got all the reason in the world to make sure people understand that this is not something they need to do without, frankly, getting advice. All right? Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.